So, today I want to talk about why the Democrats can't protect Roe v. Wade and abortion rights. Now, in the last two videos, I talked about the tactics of conservatives and Republicans to attempt to overturn Roe v. Wade, and demonstrated that Justice Alito's draft and the overturn of Roe was purposefully designed and created by these conservative and Republican tactics. Today, I'd like to talk about the Democrats' role in all of this. Now, I think it's safe to say that the current Democratic Party feels not only ineffective, but set up to fail. Between the denial of progressive voices within the party, the corporate Democrats blocking legislation at the behest of their donors, the constant capitulation to Republican interests, the consistent lies where they promise one reality to get elected and then rescind and recant those very same promises the day after they enter office, and the choice not to violate arbitrary rules that are standing in their way, it's very obvious that the Democrats have chosen a path of failure to make anything better. And while this is all true, they also recognize that they've positioned themselves as the strongest organized resistance to the onslaught of Republican fascism. The Democrats really have positioned themselves as a defensive party. Their motto might as well be, if you want to keep your rights a little longer, pick us. While many leftists do have the tendency to conflate these parties as being identical, this difference, however small, makes a difference in the lived realities of some of the most vulnerable populations in the United States. Make no mistake, the Democrats are allowing all of these bad things to happen. They are continuing policies of economic violence, of imperialism, and they're continuing to destroy the environment. But they're not the ones overturning Roe v. Wade. They're not the ones passing voting rights restrictions. They're not the ones passing anti-trans legislation. They're not the ones passing anti-abortion legislation. And they're not the ones explicitly encouraging white nationalists to take to the streets. I need it understood by people when I say this, that it is marginally better for some populations if the Democrats are in positions of state power than Republicans. And until we can provide more viable, organized alternatives, the Democrats provide an effective defense for at least some people's lives. And as long as they can maintain the position of being that strong and seeming like they're the only defensive option, people will keep turning to them. And whether you like it or not, that makes them part of a viable strategy until we can organize and do better. That said, it needs to be understood that this defensive strategy makes it so that Roe v. Wade can no longer be temporarily protected through legal means. The reality remains that the Supreme Court has a conservative majority. That's happened. All the stuff that I brought up in the previous videos, all those strategies, they came to fruition. They are active, and they are the reality we are living in. This means that even if the Democrats were willing to remove the filibuster and attempt to pass legislation upholding abortion, the Supreme Court could just find any justification to overturn it. They don't need a good reason. They just need to say that it wasn't within the spirit of the Constitution, and it's gone. The only remaining option that the Democrats have in order to preserve Roe is to completely contradict this strategy that they've been using up to this point and to actually do something effective to try to make change. The Democrats would have to not only overturn the filibuster, but pass legislation that would stack the courts with more liberal candidates, to put more liberal judges onto the bench, and to expand the court. While some Democrats have actually proposed such legislation, we know that if we that it'll fail, that this whole process is going to fail, if for no other reason than the likes of Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema. They will stop it in its tracks. And if you want to see the type of ineffectiveness that I'm talking about when it comes down to this, the New York Times put out an article talking about how can the Democrats protect Roe v. Wade? What are they doing in Congress? And one of the positions that they took is that the Democrats have revised their bill to widen its appeal. Since the vote in February, Democrats have tried to make their bill more palatable to moderate lawmakers in both parties. They stripped out a lengthy series of findings, including passages that refer to abortion restrictions as a tool of gender oppression. Also scrapped was a section clarifying that while the bill referred to women, it was meant to protect the rights of every person capable of becoming pregnant, including transgender men and non binary individuals. And I'm sorry, that is just not a point that you can be willing to compromise on. And if the other party is willing to deny human rights to that extent, to deny the reality of what's going on there, then I don't know if you can continue to work within those confines. And this is what I'm talking about when it comes to the Democratic Party. They're willing to work with this party that constantly keeps stepping on rights, keeps constantly using tactics that are vastly more aggressive to try to take over the courts, take over state governments, using corporate funding to back everything. And this is the tactic they're choosing, to compromise with that group. Yes, again, I need it reiterated. They're enabling this, but they're also not the ones doing it. And that's kind of the dilemma that we're in whenever we talk about the Democratic Party. And until, again, an alternative is provided, we are constantly going to see people leaning on this party that's actually at least paying lip service to trying to protect some rights. Now, at the end of the day, this is why the Democrats really cannot protect Roe v. Wade at this moment in time. They choose not to. And otherwise, they're boxed in by a Republican-controlled court and state legislature, and they're not willing to take the extreme steps that they need to actually make things right and to try to protect people. They consistently distance themselves from the tactics that could be used to help people, and again, constantly push away progressives, while they let a handful of corporate Democrats control the strategy. Well, as well as these so-called moderate Republicans like Senator Collins. While it would be sufficient to end this video here, I'd like to elaborate a little further as to the nature of why the Democrats actually can't protect Roe v. Wade on a slightly deeper level, with an extremely brief examination of relevant history. Now, the modern Democratic Party really does start to form during the FDR presidency. During that time, unions really became the base of power for the Democratic Party. For as flawed as many of FDR's policies were, mostly due to the racism that came out during his presidency, and how it influenced policy from the local all the way up to the federal, it's undeniable that a lot of working class people, mostly white, but a lot of working class people, did benefit from the policies introduced by the FDR presidency. Throughout the next few decades, unions and labor would make up that huge base that the Democrats would at the very least rely on, and that would put the Democrats in a position to advocate for labor rights in their platforms. Now, if you'll recall, part of the reason under the Reagan administration that the Republicans targeted unions was because they recognized this base, and they recognized that there was a lot of power in unions, and so the natural position against unions was to rely on corporate donations. And that's kind of was the basis between these two parties for a certain period of the history. And as I talked about in the last video, by around 1970, the Democrats really had that strong base in local and state government, with unions like the National Education Association working with Democratic politicians in order to pass legislation and put forth more progressive policies. This had included policies for higher taxes on the wealthy and more regulation on corporations. And while this is inadequate from a leftist perspective, it certainly did some good in terms of a liberal understanding of things, and it seemed to be pushing a lot of momentum leftward, at the very least. In addition to this, the language of some unions had gotten very radical at that time, with many identifying issues of systemic racism and the patriarchy, as well as echoing the language of a lot of the movements of the era. The various civil rights movements and radical organizations also put a lot of pressure on Democrats to create liberal compromises in order to maintain their power. The fact is, the Democrats were most effective when they had pressure put on them by organized groups of concerned people. As usual, it is only by getting people involved in social struggles and by being visible on the streets that victory of any kind can be allowed to be won. Now, by the mid 1970s, class interests and conservative backlash what basically pushed decades of labor into the background. Things changed, and the Democratic Party kind of changed along with it. They turned their backs on unions as they were slowly diminished. And this was done specifically in the Carter administration, where he enacted policies of austerity that effectively damaged labor. And the Democrats also started to take on positions, especially federally, of more conservative values. They voted yes in a majority on the Hyde Amendment and then proceeded to maintain it for 45 years. And by the 1980s, when the Republicans gutted the unions, the Democrats didn't defend or protect their former base. Instead, many sided with corporations and generally followed where the money was, and followed the Republicans even further to the right. Throughout the years, from the Carter administration all the way through Obama, Democrat-controlled Congresses have refused to defend labor or stand up against laws that were slowly gutting abortion rights and access. As a matter of fact, they actively upheld many of those same laws. Further, they backpedaled on progressive issue after progressive issue, all the while dangling that carrot in front of people that they're just mildly better than the Republicans. The Democrats by this time had solidified their position. As long as they were going to maintain that they were just mildly better than the Republicans, people would continue to vote for them. So why change that policy? Which brings me to the 2016 election. With Roe being overturned, it's unsurprising that a lot of people have looked back at the what if of a Hillary Clinton presidency. Now, I want to admit fully, had Hillary been elected, we would probably not be in quite the place we're in right now. Having a Democratic president would have at least assured continued abortion rights, as the Supreme Court might have been made slightly more liberal during those years. However, I question whether or not Hillary would have done anything to improve access or actually address the economic inequalities that have been enabled by the Democratic Party for almost 50 years now. Essentially, I genuinely believe that if Hillary had been elected, we'd be no worse than we were in 2016, but things would not have improved beyond that for sure. Now, as is consistent with the Democratic Party's policies, that's what I really believe we would have seen. Maybe things would have been different if the party had actually gone, against its own policy and actually allowed a progressive like Bernie Sanders to run for president. But unfortunately, that's not a reality we ever got to experience, and it's really difficult to predict what if there. I also need it to be understood, though, that even if Bernie had won, even if the Democrats had maintained power, the Republicans wouldn't have let up on their strategy. This has been a project that's been worked on for over 50 years for them, and the Democrats really have effectively left it uncontested. They've just let the Republicans steamroll everything. And if it wasn't now that Roe was being overturned, it's likely that it would have been overturned in the near future. So when we ask the question, why can't the Democrats protect Roe v. Wade and abortion rights? It's because the class interest of politicians and their corporate donors don't align with progressive policies of unions, feminists, and other civil rights groups. The party as a whole has no desire to listen to its own progressives or to allow them to gain any power. This is why they will continue this defensive strategy. It's why they'll always slip a little further right, and why they will never do what needs to be done. The truth is, because of this class interest and the nature of the state itself, we cannot trust the state to provide rights for us at all. And the Democrats have demonstrated that. If they're the furthest left party, how can we even begin to trust the state to provide anything for us? So I hope you'll join me next time, where I will explain further why the state cannot be trusted to protect abortion rights, or protect rights in general. So if you've enjoyed what you watched today, I hope that you'll like, comment, subscribe, and potentially join my Discord. And if you're in a place to do so, financially, and only if you're in a place to do so financially, I hope you will consider supporting me on Patreon, as a lot of these political videos are being demonetized by YouTube, and anything that you can provide is greatly appreciated and very helpful. So with that said, my name is Anarchist Theyre. Check out all the links that I mentioned in the description down below, and have a wonderful day.